Thank you, Mr. Deputy Minister, for actually opening the scene for the today's panels, and also reminding us about the motivations and the reasons why such a conference is happening in Prague every year. I see a lot of familiar faces engaging in this portfolio for years around, so I think it's becoming a tradition, and we are grateful for you to come. We have an excellent panel to talk about the realistic expectations about the NPT review next year. We've heard that there are a lot of inhibitions which probably will not allow that much success next year. But still, this is the reason for us to discuss. And with no further ado, I will pass the floor to the speakers, whom I ask to speak around 10 minutes. We have time enough, but we would like to have some debate afterwards. And I will ask them to speak in the order which is in the printed program. So first, I think it's natural we start from the global level. Ms. Angela Kane is High Representative for Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations. She was responsible for the activities of the World Disarmament Campaign, and from 2005-2008 served as Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs in New York. Mrs. Kane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting conference. The fact that President Obama made the historic speech 5 years ago really was remarkable, but I think what I would like to see this meeting, as well as starting from the Obama speech, is to see it as part, not a single isolated event, but really as part of an evolving process. I'm not going to offer you any realistic assessment, as our chairman just said, about what happens at the NPT conference. You will understand in my position, I don't really do that, but I can comment on that when there are some specific questions. But I really would like to start on a somewhat cautionary note. And as the UN's High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, I have, among my official responsibilities, a duty to do all I can to assist the Secretary General, to assist the member states, to assist civil society, to pursue the achievement of a world free of nuclear weapons. But I should say also that nuclear disarmament is not in itself an end in itself. It's instead a vital part of a larger security system based on principles and obligations that are found in the United Nations Charter. These include not just disarmament, but also the regulation of armaments, and those are the fundamental norms requiring the peaceful resolution of disputes and prohibiting the threat or use of force, the advancement of social and economic development, the protection of human rights, and the strengthening of the rule of law. There is a synergy among these goals and in the activities to achieve them. Each and every one of them is important in the maintenance of international peace and security. The architects of the Charter intended these activities to be mutually reinforcing and to be pursued together rather than in any particular step-by-step sequence, and I think this is very often forgotten. A world free of nuclear weapons, in short, would not simply be today's world minus nuclear weapons. Nuclear disarmament contributes to peace and security, yet it also benefits from progress in cultivating a wider environment of trust, of cooperation, and of mutual confidence. Hence, as we reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons, we must also limit conventional arms, substantially improve existing mechanisms and institutions for resolving disputes peacefully, and promote even larger goals of justice and prosperity. One should therefore not view any one of these goals as a precondition for achieving another. They are all integral components of a system to guide the conduct of international relations in the post-war world. Now, coming to the 2015 NPT Review Conference, it has specific purposes relating both to the assessment of past implementation of the treaty, as well as initiatives to meet future challenges. Halting the spread of nuclear weapons is one such goal, along with pursuing, and I quote, negotiations in good faith, unquote, on nuclear disarmament, as well as the promotion of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Another goal found in the NPT, though it's not typically addressed in the NPT review process, is the pursuit of a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. And this is also not a theme that is addressed in President Obama's speech, which dealt only with nuclear weapons. I believe the time will come when the relationship between nuclear disarmament and conventional arms control will once again be addressed more directly in multilateral deliberations. This could begin in the NPT review process, in the UN disarmament machinery, or in any other multilateral setting, such as a fourth special session of the General Assembly on Disarmament. It could also come about in the course of pursuing a nuclear weapons convention, or framework of mutually reinforcing legal instruments with the same goal, as recognized by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in his 5-point nuclear disarmament proposal of 2008. Many people recall that proposal, but they forget that it also included an element relating to conventional arms control and other issues extending beyond nuclear disarmament per se. Based on past practice, however, I concede that the review conference next year will not likely address these larger issues and will instead conform to the traditional focus on non-proliferation, disarmament, and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Now, it is obvious that there is a malaise among the NPT states parties regarding the treaty regime. Progress in nuclear disarmament, and the Deputy Foreign Minister just told us, is widely viewed as disappointing. Nuclear weapon modernization program, and we heard quite a bit about that yesterday, are underway with plans extending for decades. At this rate, the goal of Article 6 might not be achieved before the treaty's centenary in 2070, if then. The lack of disarmament negotiations adds to this malaise, and while we hear that nuclear weapons may be playing a, quote, reduced role, unquote, in the security postures of possessor states, the doctrine of nuclear deterrence persists, which only adds to new proliferation risks as other states pursue a dark twist on President Obama's 2009 speech, namely the illusory peace and security obtained possibly through the acquisition of nuclear weapons. There has, of course, been some progress in reducing deployments of strategic offensive nuclear weapons, as seen in the signature, referred several times here in Prague, of the New START Treaty 4 years ago. Some states have stopped producing nuclear materials for their use in weapons and have dismantled their relevant facilities while closing nuclear test sites. These are all very welcome developments. Yet when it comes to the widely agreed norms of disarmament, including verification, transparency, irreversibility, universality, and bindingness, we can only see the scale of the work that remains ahead. The difficulties in moving forward on nuclear disarmament have certainly had their effects in weakening prospects for strengthening non-proliferation controls. There are persistent concerns being voiced in the NPT review process that the treaty contains a double standard requiring strict and increasingly intrusive non-proliferation controls with a laissez-faire approach reserved for nuclear weapon states. The more this treaty is perceived as inequitable, the less effective it will be. As the basic fairness of what we call the NPT bargain increasingly comes into question, it is not surprising that difficulties have been encountered in achieving such non-proliferation goals as gaining universal support for the IAEA's additional protocol, strengthening controls over sensitive parts of the nuclear fuel cycle, adopting stricter export controls, or concluding a fissile material treaty. The often heard assertion that all of these non-proliferation controls must be strengthened as a precondition for nuclear disarmament to proceed has been widely rejected by most NPT states. This line of argument will never command a consensus in the NPT review process or in any other multilateral disarmament arena. One of the wild cards at the next review conference will be the impact of the Vienna Conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, which will start next Monday. It is clear there's growing support among both member states and civil society for a humanitarian approach to disarmament. based on the catastrophic effects of nuclear weapons. It is certain that concerned states parties will seek to incorporate this humanitarian theme into the final document of that 2015 conference, which will help to ensure that this theme remains a focus of future meetings of states parties as they work to strengthen compliance with the disarmament provisions of that treaty. Future NPT conferences, as well as deliberations in the UN disarmament machinery, will increasingly address this humanitarian theme, and the political consequence of this development may well help to improve accountability for fulfilling disarmament commitments. Yet progress in disarmament, however necessary, will not alone be sufficient as a foundation for the future of the NPT. When the NPT was extended indefinitely in 1995, part of the package deal leading to that decision was a resolution on the Middle East, as already referred to here. It called upon all states in the region to take practical steps in appropriate forums aimed at making progress towards a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and all weapons of mass destruction and their delivery systems. It also called upon such states to refrain from taking any measures that would preclude the achievement of this objective. The linkage of the establishment of this zone to the decision on the indefinite extension of the treaty is very significant. A nuclear weapon-free zone for this region has been a goal found in annual General Assembly resolutions since 1974, and there has never been a single negative vote on any of those resolutions. The broader WMD-free zone has been repeatedly endorsed in NPT arenas, including the Review Conference of 2000 and 2010. The latter set forth specific benchmarks for convening a conference on the establishment of such a zone, including a role for the UN Secretary-General in convening such a conference. Though it has not yet taken place, consultations are continuing to fulfill this mandate, and they will surely continue since this issue is not going to go away. I share the view of many that progress in convening such a conference and in commencing a process for establishing such a zone would substantially contribute to the wider peace process. The UN, of course, has long endorsed such zones, as seen in our support for the establishment of the 5 regional nuclear weapon-free zones. While regional security is certainly a key goal of those treaty regimes, it is not the only goal. All the zonal treaties explicitly identify nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament among their broader goals. Recent proposals, therefore, to establish new regional zones in Northeast Asia and the Arctic should arguably be viewed in a similar light. They offer regional security benefits while further reinforcing a global norm against nuclear weapons themselves. They are worthy projects indeed, for they would contribute to both goals. As for the future of the NPT regime, it has reached a crucial juncture. If the common interest prevails, and if participants recognize that national interests are served best by achieving each of the goals of the treaty, its future will be bright. Yet if such gatherings continue to resemble more of an arena for staking out claims and the advancement of perceived interests of specific states, the treaty regime may soon be facing its last sunset. For the sake of future generations and the future of our planet, I hope that the participants attending that event, starting in April, will choose their positions wisely. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kane. Second speaker will be, we have representatives of institutions very much respectful in this panel, and one of them is Monterey Institute of International Studies, and Professor Potter is founding director of the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at this institute. And it's also author of, quite prolific author. People who engage in non-proliferation are sometimes prolific in writing, and it doesn't exclude that, but Professor Potter is one of them. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here to share the panel with my very distinguished colleagues and good friends. One advantage of having participated as a delegate in 4 prior review conferences is that it provides a useful perspective from which to evaluate the current state of NPT affairs, which by almost all accounts is not very positive. Indeed, as I will explain in a few minutes, I can imagine at least 3 scenarios in which the review conference falters and not only fails to produce a consensus document, but leaves the kind of nasty aftertaste that negatively affects the NPT and the broader non-proliferation regime. That being said, it also is useful to recall the very severe challenges that have faced prior review conferences and the ability in a number of these past instances for states parties to show the kind of flexibility and creativity to produce what most observers regarded to be successful outcomes. At the conclusion of my remarks, I'll return to this point and explore the degree to which the conditions that made possible these successes are likely to exist in 2015. But let me turn first to the major challenges. The first, as was noted by my predecessor on the panel here, we certainly have to confront the issues of the Middle East. And just as the 1995 resolution on the Middle East made possible the indefinite extension of the NPT without a vote, the recommendations on the Middle East in the 2010 final document were instrumental in forging a consensus on the overall document, including the 64 action items. While the convening of the overdue conference on the Middle East prior to the 2015 RevCon will not remove the issue of the Middle East as a source of major contention at the next review conference, failure to convene the meeting is apt to be extremely disruptive, will almost certainly contaminate the environment at the review conference, and may spill over into other areas, including those related to nuclear disarmament. What needs to be remembered in this context is that the consensus that was reached in 2010 was actually a rather fragile one, in which many members of the non-aligned movement in particular were dissatisfied with the terms of the disarmament action plan, but deferred to the Egyptian chair of the non-aligned movement, who placed a priority on the Middle East recommendations. If a major component of those recommendations remains unmet, one should expect a much harder line by NAM on disarmament and other issues at the next review conference. Regardless of what transpires regarding the Middle East, the review conference will also have to figure out how it will assess the action plan. On the one hand, there have been statements from some nuclear weapon states which suggest that there is no need for a formal assessment of the implementation of the 64 items, that they are only aspirational in nature, and that many of them can simply be rolled over for the next review cycle. On the other hand, some non-nuclear weapon states have made it very clear that they expect the RevCon to evaluate the progress or lack thereof with respect to the items, to prioritize among them, perhaps add additional items, and provide more explicit timelines for their implementation. A major task for states parties in the lead-up to the April meeting will be to think through how best to address the action plan so that consideration of the plan enhances rather than obstructs the review process. Although there are 22 items dealing with disarmament in the action plan, none of which directly mentions the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, one should expect a great deal of attention during deliberations in Main Committee 1 and Subsidiary Body 1 to focus on the issue of the humanitarian impact. Perhaps the most interesting thing to look for will be the degree to which participation by the United States and the UK in next week's conference in Vienna will isolate those nuclear weapon states who still remain outside of the nearly universal support among NPT members for the initiative. While one should be cautious not to assume that U.S. participation in Vienna will remove its concerns about the initiative, it will make it easier for the U.S. To let Russia and France in particular take the heat on the subject and could provide the U.S. with some leverage in fashioning language on the humanitarian impact that will garner at least near consensus. If the 2015 RevCon somehow manages to finesse the issues of the Middle East and disarmament, which most observers identify as the most acute challenges, it could still be derailed by an issue that has not previously been prominent in the review process, namely the crisis in Ukraine. I actually was surprised that this subject did not have a greater impact on the 2014 PrepCom, but I would caution against assuming that this state of affairs will persist. Indeed, I would bet that P5 solidarity at the review conference may well collapse under the weight of the downward spiral of U.S.-Russian relations elsewhere, and that the issue of Ukraine may arise in a number of ways. Almost certainly there will be many statements in the general debate that condemn Russian disregard for the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. These interventions have the potential to be particularly acrimonious, and it's hard to anticipate how individual personalities will respond. The issue of Ukraine also is likely to arise in the discussion about negative security assurances and the discussion of the role of nuclear weapons in alliance policy. In addition, one can imagine the issue arising in the discussion of the value of nuclear weapons abstinence, as the review conference will correspond with the 20th anniversary of Ukraine's decision to join the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. Earlier this year, one senior representative from a nuclear weapon state suggested that Ukraine's decision to refrain from nuclear weapons possession was ill-advised, and if this view is repeated, it could fuel a major debate over the benefits of nuclear weapons abstinence, a debate that could be linked to the favorable and imprudent treatment of nuclear weapons possessors and a non-NPT party in the form of nuclear trade arrangements. Yet another area where the issue may arise is the realm of nuclear safeguards, a particularly complicated realm given the presence in Crimea of a major Ukrainian nuclear facility. The last item on my very incomplete list of major challenges is what I believe will be the key procedural issue and one that could bring down the conference. It pertains to how the President proposes to deal with the forward-looking and retrospective portions of the final document. As many of you are aware, only the forward-looking component of the 2010 document was a consensus document. The review portion was not adopted by consensus and reflected the President's views of what had transpired. While I believe that approach was a reasonable one and should not be excluded for 2015, some states' parties have very different views on the subject, and my guess is that it could be a very divisive debate, and this is a big if one were able to reach agreement on the forward-looking portion of the document. I've conveyed in a very abbreviated fashion some of the likely challenges we will face at the next review conference. Let me conclude my prepared remarks by touching upon what I regard to be necessary, if not sufficient, conditions for a successful review conference. And by success, I do not mean necessarily one that produces a very low common denominator consensus document. Rather, I have in mind a conference at which the most important challenges facing the non-proliferation regime are fully addressed and serious efforts are made to fashion cooperative strategies for dealing with them. In noting these conditions, I will make reference to how they were or were not present in past recent review conferences. The first point, it will focus on presidential leadership. The recipe for a successful RevCon begins with the leadership of the conference. It's essential that the President have a clear vision of what he or she wishes to achieve and formulates a strategy consistent with those objectives. As the cases of 2000 and 2010 demonstrate, it's not essential that the President have an extensive background in the non-proliferation sphere in order to succeed. It's very important, however, for the President to select key personnel and to know when and when not to delegate authority to these individuals. A key reason for the ability of the 2010 RevCon to forge consensus on the issues of disarmament in the Middle East, for example, were the inspired decisions by the conference president to select exceptionally talented diplomats in the persons of Alexander Marshak and Alison Kelly to chair subsidiary bodies 1 and 2, respectively. And I might note that Alison Kelly, who is now the Irish ambassador in Prague, is actually with us, and so any of the tough questions dealing with the Middle East we can direct to Alison. As it turns out, the president for 2015, Algerian ambassador Taous Farouki, has far more experience on nuclear issues than did her compatriot Abdallah Bali, who nevertheless was very effective in his presiding over the 2000 RevCon. A wise and creative president and other conference leaders, however, will not go very far if key states are inflexible in their positions and unwilling to compromise. In all of those review conferences that are widely regarded as successful, one can point to the element of flexibility, which in turn often was a function of the perceived dangers facing the treaty and the need for common action. The most recent examples of the importance of this approach was the flexibility shown by all key parties, I emphasize by all key parties, in the negotiation of the recommendations on the Middle East at the 2010 RevCon, and the absence of such flexibility at the failed 2005 RevCon. I've previously noted as a question mark whether P5 solidarity will prevail in 2015. While such solidarity may be regarded by some states as a negative when it comes to advancing disarmament, one can argue that in balance, U.S.-Soviet cooperation at past review conferences and U.S.-Russian cooperation as well, and the ability of the P5 to coordinate their positions or to agree to disagree has made it possible to reach consensus when agreement seemed unlikely. A good example of this point came in 2000 when a joint P5 statement effectively removed the issue of the ABM Treaty, one of the most contentious issues at the time, from the review conference debate, making it possible to fashion the 13 practical steps. It will be interesting to see if the P5 is able to reach any meaningful agreements at their meeting in London this February, and if so, how it will impact on the review conference. While the joint P5 statement was helpful in reducing an irritant in 2000, perhaps even more important was the presence of the New Agenda Coalition, which proved extremely adept at serving as a bridge builder between the nuclear weapon states and key non-nuclear weapon states, especially those from the non-aligned movement. The NAC still exists, albeit in reduced number, but it remains to be seen if it or any other political coalition can perform the same bridging function that NAC executed to perfection in 2000. Here, as in many cases of diplomacy, personalities matter a great deal, and one cannot underestimate the role played by Egyptian diplomat Maged Abdelaziz at the last review conference. As even some of his Egyptian critics noted, he was a deal maker, and a deal indeed was made. When I discuss proliferation challenges, I often distinguish between those that arise within the NPT and those that are external to it. By the same token, even if all of the conditions I've mentioned are met, it's still quite possible that states parties will struggle in vain to reach an accord if there is an unfavorable external environment. This environment could include a breakdown in the P5+1 negotiations with Iran, further escalation in the West's relations with Russia, another nuclear weapons test by North Korea, and a host of other wild cards which by their very nature are hard to anticipate. By the same token, progress on the Iranian front, an improvement in the situation involving Ukraine, a breakthrough in the Middle East, all would have the potential to change the review process calculus and make possible what otherwise might be improbable. That brings me to my last major determinant, luck. It's a very thin reed on which to build a successful NPT review conference, but looking at my crystal ball, which is not at all encouraging, I'm reminded of similarly dire forecasts, including some of my own, before past review conferences. I suspect that luck played some role, and while I'm not optimistic about 2015, I believe we are lucky to have a very experienced president-designate in place, an extraordinarily talented Secretary General who helped to work his magic at the last review conference, a tireless and absolutely committed High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, and an Executive Secretary whom I know dreams literally of the day when the United States will ratify the CTBT. He can tell you more about the date when this will happen. With that leadership group and a little luck, why shouldn't we imagine a successful review conference next spring? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was thorough, and thank you also for acknowledging many people in the room who deserve it. Ambassador Kelly and others. We're now moving to my right wing here. CIPRI and IAEA are two respective institutions of different sort. Tariq Rauf is now at CIPRI, but he has a long record with IEA. So we are moving to this nexus between policy and science and technology on my right side. Tariq Rauf, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jerry Snyder. I would like to thank also First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Peter Rulak, and the Director of the Institute for International Relations, Prague, Dr. Peter Kracevil, as well as Mikkel Smetna of Charles University for the opportunity to be at this conference in this beautiful venue. I will start by recalling a few anniversaries and not repeat points already made by previous speakers, and will focus mainly on some key issues: the strengthened review process for the NPT, and the desired outcome for the 2015 NPT Review Conference. In 2015, next year, the Review Conference will mark the 45th anniversary of the entry into force of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the world's most widely adhered to and the most significant multilaterally negotiated arms control treaty. It will be the 20th anniversary of the indefinite extension of the treaty that, lest we forget, was based on an integrated package of decisions and a resolution. It will be the 15th anniversary of the unequivocal undertaking given by the nuclear weapon states to achieve nuclear disarmament. And of course, it will be the 5th anniversary of agreement at the last review conference on the 64 actions to strengthen the implementation of the treaty in all of its 3 pillars. The NPT was the first international or multilaterally negotiated treaty that included a formal review process. This review process was intended to balance off the different obligations of the 2 categories of states that are in the treaty: the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. Over the years, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference has acquired the status of being the sovereign of the treaty. It is at review conferences that states parties meet to assess the implementation of this treaty and to reach agreement on recommendations for strengthening the integrity and authority of the treaty over the next 5-year period. This was explicitly agreed in the first decision that was adopted as part of the extension package in 1995 and further improved in 2000. We will start next year's review conference on a good footing, at least as far as procedural arrangements are concerned. At this year's NPT Preparatory Committee meeting, which was held in New York, we have agreement on the draft rules of procedure. We know who the Secretary General of the conference will be, and Bill has already mentioned that, Tom Markram, Chief of the Weapons of Mass Destruction Branch at the Office of Disarmament Affairs, headed by Madame Angela Kane. We have agreement on the provisional agenda for the conference, and we also have agreed on the establishment of the subsidiary bodies for each of the 3 main committees. The agenda for the review conference is very logical and simple. It is basically to review the operation of the treaty, taking into account the decisions and resolution of the 1995 conference, as well as the final document and outcomes of 2000 and 2010. We have chairs of the 3 main committees. Ambassador Enrique Roman More of Peru will chair Main Committee 1, which will deal with disarmament affairs. Ambassador Cristian Estrada of Romania will deal with Main Committee 2, that's nuclear verification, regional issues including the Middle East. And Ambassador David Stewart of Australia will deal with the 3rd Main Committee, which deals with peaceful uses of nuclear energy. In recent years, as Bill has alluded, the chairs of subsidiary bodies played a very important role in contributing to the elements of the document that were the forward-looking documents. But a result of this was that the chairs of the main committees themselves were somewhat weakened and couldn't play as much of a role as they could have. So I would recommend that at next year's review conference, the chair also plays an important role in terms of the subsidiary body, and perhaps we can reverse the role played in the past. This has nothing to do with the able service provided by previous chairs of subsidiary bodies, but to ensure that the chair of each main committee just discharges their responsibility so that the main committee can produce an outcome for that committee that deals both with the backward-looking parts and the forward-looking parts that would form the final document. The presidents of NPT review conferences traditionally have always come from the non-aligned movement, as it has the largest group of states parties. This year it is the turn of Africa, and after some searching, largely because the omens for next year are so bad, no one was really volunteering for this job. I'm very pleased that Ambassador Taus Farooqi, with whom I worked in Vienna when I was at the IAEA, she was the chairman of the board. She chaired a very important committee on strengthening safeguards. She chaired the NAM chapter in Vienna. She has gracefully accepted this challenge and will follow in the footsteps of one of her predecessors, Ambassador Bali, who chaired a successful conference in 2010. And given Madam Farooqi's personality, I'm sure she will likely continue the tradition of the president of the very first NPT review conference, Ambassador Inga Thorsson of Sweden, who guided the states parties to agree to a final document by dint of her determination. Now, the foreign ministry of our host country is reviewed by the Department of Inspection General and Internal Audit. Many other foreign ministries are reviewed by auditors and inspectors general. Corporations are reviewed by their boards and others, and their annual reports cover past activities and future plans. So why is it that in the NPT review process, states parties are failing serially to agree on a review of past implementation of the treaty and of the implementation of outcomes and recommendations that they themselves have agreed to at previous review conferences? Is it because of a fear of accountability? Is it reflective of an ostrich-like approach of burying heads in the sand? Is it because of laziness and or decline in the standards of expertise in NPT matters? Is it due to groupthink or pressure from political groupings? Is it because of the failings of the chairs of the main committees? Is it due to the energies of delegations being devoted to and sapped in the negotiations in the various bodies? The correct answer, as the thought might have crossed your minds, is all of the above. One possible way out might be to reflect both the diverging and the converging views of states. If states cannot agree on how the treaty and the outcomes of previous review conferences have been implemented in the previous 5-year period, then the outcome document should be able to reflect both the views where there is agreement and views where there is not agreement. And this is not rocket science. The 1985 review conference document was actually fashioned in this way. And there would be a part where countries have managed to reach agreement. On the forward-looking part, given the current international situation, I think we need to be realistic and try to learn from past mistakes. Having been a delegate at 5 previous review conferences, I find that there has been a marked proliferation in the length and the number of speeches, and the length and the number of working papers submitted at review conferences and preparatory committees. Symbolic Twitter practice of 140 characters does not seem to apply in this regard. In 1995, the first decision on the strengthened review process was only 7 paragraphs. The decision on principles and objectives was 7 preambular paragraphs and 20 operational ones. In 2000, we had 189 paragraphs. In 2010, there were 91. And in the preparatory committees in 2012 and 13, there were 100 paragraphs each. So no wonder the energy of delegates was sapped in putting together these paragraphs on which there was no agreement. Fortunately, at this year's PrepCom, the chair had a much shorter paper. It was only 17 paragraphs. So I'm reminded of Shelley's poem, and I quote, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." In the poem, the pharaoh's works are nowhere to be seen in the desert wasteland. To press on in the poetic theme, in Coleridge's Kubla Khan, a stately pleasure dome was built in Xanadu by the place where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea, where Kubla Khan heard ancestral voices bringing prophecies of war. To exaggerate a bit to make the point, there is not much to be seen in the context of the implementation of the 2010 actions, the 2000 recommendations, and the 1995 principles and objectives. So we might well look on our works at these past review conferences and despair. And these measureless rivers of words flow into nothingness. And war, we have these as well. but hopefully not nuclear war. Fortunately, this year, fortunately, there will be this conference to be held in Vienna on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And this is an initiative that now has the support of some 150 states. And we need to find ways whereby the non-nuclear weapon states can engage with the nuclear weapon states, rather than go through the litany of what nuclear weapons can do, because that is well known. So I would recommend that at the Vienna conference there should be substantive engagement in the following terms. That the nuclear weapon states explain the human health and environmental consequences of nuclear weapon development and testing programs since their inception, describe the fail-safe mechanisms for dealing with false alarms and safety and security system failures, as well as backup systems and their reliability under stress conditions, the mechanisms that have been put in place to prevent an accidental detonation of nuclear weapons in deployed and storage modes, including the human health and environmental remediation procedures and the infrastructure related to that, the record of system breakdowns and normal accidents of nuclear weapon systems, the design basis threat assumptions and calculations of catastrophic, unplanned, force majeure events with regard to nuclear weapon safety and security, scenarios for regional global food security, human health, psychological and critical infrastructure implications of any detonation of nuclear weapons, public education efforts with regard to the dangers and risks of nuclear weapons and nuclear doctrines, and viable processes to achieve disarmament and elimination of nuclear weapons. I think this could provide a fruitful basis for an exchange of views, rather than running through horrific pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and going through all of the medical and environmental consequences that nuclear weapons detonations would ensue, because we already know that. I haven't addressed many other important issues because some of my previous speakers have already done so, and the next speaker definitely will address one of the key unfulfilled parts of our business from the past, that is the entry into force of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. So let me conclude by referring to one issue which deals with Main Committee 2, and that is safeguards. Bill has already touched upon this, and a new bone of contention is what at the IAEA is described as the state-level concept, by which in the implementation of safeguards in non-nuclear weapon states, the IAEA makes use of all information available to it, including information provided by third parties or so-called intelligence information. The controversy is not over the use of intelligence information. The controversy is over the authenticity of such information and the opportunity provided to the accused state to have access to such information and to be able to defend itself before the Board of Governors. I don't have time to go into the details, but I'd be happy to address any questions that might come up there. So with that, I would thank everyone for listening to my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was what I expected, but it wasn't about scientific technology. It was about diplomatic technology, or I would call it diplomatic chemistry, which is necessary for such conferences like NPT Review. So thank you very much for your insights. Last but not least, it was mentioned, you're really moving into the nexus with the science, because our next speaker, Mr. Lassina Zerbo, is a founder of a data exploitation center. This is a nexus for scientists to go into, and it was just a good preach about safeguards and using information. Information is vitally important. Mr. Zerbo is the Executive Secretary of the PrepCom for CTBTO, and we're happy to have him here, and I'll give him the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Schneider, and then let me take this opportunity to thank the organizers for inviting me to this conference, but more importantly to this panel. And thank my predecessors as well for what they've said and what they haven't said. which is a good thing when you speak the last in a panel, because it gives you several opportunities. If you are not prepared, you listen to them and then you talk according to what they say. If you are prepared, so you may want to change, depending on how...
But you are prepared, Mr.
So hopefully. And if they try to lead you into a direction, which is what the moderator is saying, into scientific, you decide whether you want to go there or you want to do something different, which is just to say that I'm in an excellent position. And okay, so having said this, let me go by saying that this NPT Review Conference, Prospects and Challenges, we know a lot about the challenges facing the NPT. One of the points that I think we know a little bit less about is prioritization of the challenges and then the perception of states, member states, on those challenges, how they perceive it, how they perceive the very nature of these challenges. And those are the issues that I see myself, and then I'll come to that. So talking about this, let me say that the Iran's nuclear program serves as a case point in point. While some view Iran's nuclear program as a proliferation challenge and an issue of possible non-compliance, others may view it as an issue of denial of access to nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. And I know why I'm saying this, because I've been going around and talking to people, especially in the developing world. I can tell you that this feeling is there. But the Prague conference raises a very pertinent question in how it framed this particular panel. How should we view success in the 2015 NPT Review Conference beyond the adoption of another consensus document? And then my predecessors have talked about how those different consensus documents were adopted and then what were the outcome and so forth. So what is success and how do we measure this success in the context of the NPT Review Conference? Success should not be measured only by agreement on a final document. And you will forgive me for being CTBT biased, because I will take the CTBT as an example. And I guess my friend Professor Potter put that in context so that you all accept to forgive me for coming into how the CTBT fits in that picture. So I would take the question one step further and highlight that past review conferences that did not produce a consensus final document may have, in fact, been successful in furthering the principles and objectives of the NPT. Let me take the example of 1990 NPT Review Conference that was unable to achieve a consensus on a final document based on the unwillingness of some state parties to endorse the need for a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. However, this perceived failure reinforced the linkages between the CTBT and the NPT and laid the groundwork for the CTBT to play a major role in the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference. Further illustrating the significant role that the CTBT has played in the NPT review process, the 2000 NPT Review Conference designated the entry into force of the CTBT as the first of the 13 practical disarmament steps, with the second being the continued moratorium on nuclear testing until this objective was met. Now, the NPT 2010 conference. Moving forward to the final document of the 2010 NPT Review Conference and the Consensus Action Plan on Nuclear Disarmament, it becomes clear that the conference was driven in large by one particular objective: an agreement on measures to advance the implementation of the 1995 resolution on the Middle East. To be sure, there were some notable achievements in other areas. In the context of the CTBT, for example, and I'm once again a CTBT biased person, with no surprise, the 2010 conference succeeded in elevating the treaty out of the debate between its classification as a non-proliferation or a disarmament measure, and instead reaffirmed its vital importance as a core element of the non-proliferation regime as a whole. The conference also encouraged state parties to fully develop the treaty's verification regime, including the early completion and provisional operationalization of the international monitoring system, a first step in the context of the NPT review process. This outcome was arguably the result of the willingness of state parties to make compromises on some key issues in order to achieve a consensus final document. In the end, state parties addressed the resolution on the Middle East through the agreement on the conference to be convened by the UN Secretary General and the co-sponsor of the Middle East resolution in 2012. So let me briefly touch on nuclear testing in the context of the NPT review process. Eloquent expression of support of the CTBT and its entry into force within the NPT review process and other multilateral fora are welcome. But they alone will not suffice to ensure a future for the CTBT entry into force. In securing the entry into force of the CTBT is truly a priority. If securing the entry into force of the CTBT is a priority of the international community, then it is time to put word into action and action into results. The CTBT is not simply one of many disarmament and non-proliferation initiatives that have arisen in the context of the NPT review process. It is of, and I quote, vital importance and a core element of the NPT. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the keynote speaker yesterday, Undersecretary Rose Gottmuller, for the leadership she's taking, a leadership that I want to say fits with Rose's personality. Rose is very calm, persistent, very convincing in her own way, and then it's with pleasure that we do our best in the Secretariat to see how we can help Rose in the work she does in the United States to create the condition for a ratification that my friend Bill Porter said that I'm dreaming of, and then I have a date. And I will not share this date with you because it's getting closer and closer. And if I share it with you, you might hold it against me. But this is between me and a few people. But when it comes to reality, I will tell you I had my crystal ball, and then Bill will say I was right. And I hopefully will give me a prize for that. So there are clear linkages between the two treaties. And I've said it, I've talked about it already, I won't get into the detail. The CTBT and the NPT are mutually reinforcing. And an erosion of support for either treaty will inevitably result in the detriment of both. Now, looking ahead to the 2015, let's say, I've heard it, honest dialogue and confidence building. Looking ahead, it's perfectly clear that progress on the CTBT will not make or break the conference. But we must take care not to diminish the strong message of universal responsibility for achieving the treaty's entry into force in the process of seeking consensus on other issues. And this is key. We might be discussing at the 2015, and the direction will go one way or another because people are looking for a consensus document, and then it will kill all the wins that we had on the past review conferences regarding the CTBT. But then again, do we simply view the adoption of a consensus document of non-binding political commitment as a successful outcome? Will an updated and amended action plan suffice to further the full and effective implementation of the NPT? Perhaps more important is the role of the review process in facilitating an open and honest dialogue on the key challenges facing the nuclear non-proliferation regime. My view has been that the only way to achieve this objective is to work tirelessly to build trust and confidence in the treaty and its verification regime. Member states with legitimate concern over the impact of adhering to the treaty for their national interests need credible assurances that the treaty is effective, verifiable, and unforeseeable. In this way, the CTBT and its verification regime need to be capable of fulfilling the needs of all parties by taking small but concrete confidence-building steps to increase understanding of the treaty and its contribution to international peace and security. The only way to accomplish this is through engagement. Engagement at the scientific and technical level, that's the only time I will be talking about science and technology, and when appropriate, at the political level. For example, we're about to wrap up the Integrated Field Exercise 2014, which is being conducted along the banks of the Dead Sea in Jordan. The IFE-14 is the largest and most technologically advanced simulated on-site inspection ever conducted by the CTBTO, involving 4 years of preparation, 150 tons of specialized equipment, and over 200 experts from the region and around the world. And I want to take this opportunity to thank my dear friend Angela Kane for witnessing this exercise, and thank the Director General of OPCW as well, who sent his Director of Verification to see how this is progressing, and all the NGOs that have participated, including my professor, Bill Porter, whom we've missed, but who just gave me his apologies for why he wasn't there, because I wanted to hold it against him. So Bill, I will not hold it against you because you probably have a good report on it. So in conclusion, as with the CTBT, the challenges facing the NPT and the nuclear non-proliferation regime stem from deep division and mistrust between states. These diverging viewpoints will not be easily reconciled, but rather than focus on the end game and the grand bargaining, perhaps there will be an opportunity to agree to confidence-building steps that may pave the way for concrete action to strengthen the non-proliferation norm and help build consensus on measures to promote nuclear disarmament. And I wanted to add one thing, because I was at different conferences recently, and the last thing I'm talking about is how we fit all those elements in what is today the beautiful, I would say, lady that we all pushing towards the nuclear security. I call it in our context because in my culture, when something is new and beautiful, you identify it to a lady. Okay? So I call the nuclear security as the beautiful lady of the moment. But I think one thing is to talk about nuclear security, to talk about NPT, to talk about CTBT, all separately in a stovepipe manner. But I think in the end, we have no ways than linking all those issues together. Because when I go to the developing world, when you talk about nuclear security, when you talk about nuclear non-proliferation, when you talk about nuclear disarmament, when you talk about CTBT, you talk about IAEA, they don't know the difference. It's one for them. It's one for them because they want to deal with all those aspects in a holistic manner. And we shouldn't neglect that aspect. It's the only way we can move forward, because we can develop, we can make recommendation, take decision, but to implement those recommendations, we have to liaise with those who will implement. And those who implement this are far but close. They're from the developing world, and they have to be part of this game, part of our search for peace and stability and security. Thank you.
Thank you. As you may recognize, I'm in a difficult position because all four speakers are, there's not many differences between them. They are all working hard in the same direction. They would love to have some achievements. We don't have the enemies of this progress in the panel. So it's up to me to challenge these honorable and respectable experts and diplomats who are working hard, using all the skills to achieve a consensus, but they are challenged by the outside world, which is not full of trust and confidence, it's up to them to find a way where is the biggest chance to have a breakthrough and to have an achievement, sometimes surprising, against the circumstances which are not prone to any progress. But the circumstances haven't been prone for a progress even in the past, and so we shouldn't be that pessimistic. So I announced that I will be a little bit challenging, and so before I give the floor to the audience, I would like to ask the panelists, in my view, the biggest challenge is that the diplomats are living in a bubble, but the politicians and the statesmen are a disruptive element to that, because they are coming to the agenda at the last moment, and the question is whether it fits their goals. One of the disruptive moments which is close to us, and I'm glad that the next panel will talk about the regional implications, is Ukraine and the consequence of the war in Ukraine. It has been mentioned that I think Bill Potter called it, benefits of nuclear weapons abstinence are not that clear after what happened in Ukraine. How we'll be able to address this is a political issue. This is not about a diplomatic way to find a consensus on a document. This is about do we really believe that this is going to work? We all know that there's no way back. Ukrainians know it as well. I think this is not a question, it's just a question of the credibility of this concept of disarmament, the benefits for the countries who give up nuclear weapons are not clear after this. I leave aside the question of are we going to witness more nuclear capabilities in Crimea before we start the NPT conference. It might be another, I wouldn't call it wild card, but it's quite predictable that we might witness, there have already been some reports of dual capability aircrafts in Crimea. I mean, that might be a disruptive political element which has a direct relation to the agenda of the conference. Nuclear-free zone in Middle East, sore point. Of course, we know about that. The next panel will deal with that. I may ask you if you would like to comment on the other zones. Of course, we're focused on the Middle East. It seems to be the most difficult, more difficult, but if you would like to comment on the other areas from the global point of view. So from my perspective as a moderator and a challenger of this big stock of goodwill you all presented, I'm trying to challenge that and ask you how you'll be fighting with the obstacles on that road. And especially I see a lack of trust and confidence in the political class as a major obstacle, which even the most skillful diplomats are sometimes not able to bridge. With that, I give you some time to think about my comments, and I'm opening the floor to questions. Okay, a lady over there. Oh, I see a lot of questions. So I have like 3 questions and comments, and then we'll ask the panel to respond. I ask you to be brief. Yes, lady over there. Yes, please. Touch. Yes.
Oh, sorry. I'm Maria Rubley, and I'm from Australia National University, and I want to thank the panelists for just an amazing, very rich set of talks. I know we've all been filling up our notebooks here, but I have a question in particular for Tariq Raf. I was enchanted by your list of what the nuclear weapons should be asked to explain and describe. I think that I used to work for the Environmental Protection Agency in the US government, and I worked for environmental information. And the idea was that we could help environmental compliance in states by just asking them to provide information about the environmental health. So in fact, they set up a database. You could type in your zip code and see what environmental problems there were nearby. And the idea was by providing this information, it would lead to better environmental policies on the part of the states because they'd be embarrassed. And I think there's a real opportunity here to let the nuclear weapon states explain, well, what would you do in all of these cases? And it's both a way for the nuclear weapon states to have to explain themselves, but also a way for to motivate the public, motivate potential academics. And I really hope that that's something that's taken seriously, and perhaps you could relist those factors and tell us what you think the likelihood is that that could be taken forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alan Ware, Global Coordinator of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. I have a question of the panellists, particularly Angela Kane and Bill Potter, with regards to where the humanitarian impact process can have some impact on the NPT, but not just the NPT review conference and beyond that, particularly on the norm of the non-use of nuclear weapons. If we've seen the humanitarian consequences as really highlighting the impact of any use of nuclear weapons, and already in the statement from the United States announcing the coming, there was an emphasis on the practice of non-use and on preventing use. Do you think there's any possibility of either at the 2015 NPT review conference or perhaps at the 2018 high-level conference on nuclear disarmament that there'll be further progress, either an agreement on no first use of nuclear weapons or an agreement on the prohibition of the use of nuclear weapons? Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom Sauer from the University of Antwerp in Belgium. My question is about the significance of a possible or likely failure of the review conference and how it is perceived. Maybe I'm wrong, but I doubt whether the nuclear weapon states really worry about a failed review conference. There have been a lot of failed review conferences in the past, and the NPT still exists. So how do you assess this laissez-faire approach, to use Angela Kane's words, by some of the nuclear weapon states? And are they not playing with fire? And maybe a bit provocative, is there no risk that the NPT review conferences will be overtaken by the humanitarian approach conferences as the main gathering in the future? especially if enough non-nuclear weapon states are willing to establish a nuclear weapons ban.
Okay, thank you. Bernd?
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. I'm Bernd Kubik from PRIF in Frankfurt. I have a question for Madam High Representative and one for Bill Potter, and I would like to include Ambassador Kelly since she's here. My question to you, Madam High Representative, is it fair to say that this new kind of focused bilateralism between Russia and the United States, despite the Ukrainian crisis, can still be applied and used to make the Helsinki conference happen successful and sustainable? Is there still a way until the NPT Rio conference starts in April next year? My question to you is, Bill Potter, is it fair to say that the deal in 2010 that you, I think, rightly praised had a bad taste in Israel? Israel's name was named, I think, if I'm not mistaken, as part of this deal, and I think it made the start of the WMD discussions on the zone fairly difficult at the beginning. Can a deal be made in New York next year without having such negative repercussions? And I think I would like to get an answer also from Ambassador Kelly if she wants to. Thank you.
Okay, I would suggest, I know about you, we will have 4 more questions or comments later on, but I will give now panelists a chance to ask. They were concrete questions, so that they will not be forgotten. Mr. Raab, would you start with that question about the impact? And then...
Thank you. While we've already had these 2 conferences in Oslo and Mexico, and now we are having the 3rd conference, there hasn't really been any engagement with the nuclear weapon states. It's the converted going to the conference, talking to each other, feeling happy, and former chairman of the US Federal Reserve once used the term irrational exuberance. And I detected some of that at the NPT PrepCom when I was helping the chair, when certain delegations came in, and for them Nirvana was just around the corner through this conference. But that's not what's happening. So the United States will be there and the UK will be there as well, but we don't know what this engagement will be. And there have been, for a long time, we know the environmental effects of nuclear weapons practices, particularly testing in the atmosphere, underwater, underground. But the governments themselves have not formally acknowledged it in a formal forum. So I think this could provide a forum and a sort of a therapy for them to put out the information, because the weapon states say to the non-weapon states, these are our weapons, we know how to take care of them, they are safe, don't worry, we've kept them safe, we haven't had an accident for 50 or 60 years, so don't bother us. And we have already come down dramatically from the heights of the Cold War, and just, we are moving in that right direction, not at the pace that you would like, but we are making progress. So I think the new element here is that it can provide a basis for this engagement. And a big criticism of the weapon states is that the real objective of this particular initiative is a delegitimization of nuclear weapons, a prohibition, or a nuclear weapons convention, and this really irks the nuclear weapon states. I am fully in support for the delegitimization and the prohibition, but here we are trying to convince some countries to do something that they don't want to do. And so we need to find a way to persuade them that it's in their own interest to do so, rather than lecturing to them, giving them all these lectures about global food shortages, environmental catastrophes, and so on, because that really doesn't cut any ice. We were dealing with hard-boiled security analysts, and the non-nuclear weapon states really lose in credibility because they are being tuned out. And therefore, I suggested this at the EU Non-Proliferation Conference in Brussels to Assistant Secretary Tom Countryman, and to his credit, he said, if the discussion in Vienna could be somewhat along these lines, then at least the US would find it productive to do that. So I think, I'm not sure how this will happen. And just by being present, is not enough. I heard yesterday credit being given that India and Pakistan were present. All they were doing was local, low-level embassy officials were sitting behind their nameplates, keeping their seat warm. And they were getting all the credit. So this is again, this irrational exuberance. And while it's good, we also need to be practical in this area. There are many other things to say, but I'll just end there.
Okay.
Thank you. There were a couple of questions that were directly addressed to me. Let me start with the Middle East zone and whether is there a way to continue it. I will say to you that with regard to the P3 participation with the facilitator, Undersecretary Laajava of Finland and us, or myself, there has been no disruption in the work. In fact, it's actually accelerated quite a bit. We have very regular video conferences, at least like twice a week. I also recognize Sandro Hatsitakis, who is here of the facilitators team today. And there is now the question of, is the League of Arab States going to accept the facilitator's proposal to hold another pre-negotiation consultation in Geneva at the end of this month, actually, or not. And that will actually be determined next week when the Senior Officials Committee is meeting, and they will take a decision on this. There's definitely been an evolution in the positions, meaning that there has been more of an impatience with the whole process, that the facilitator and the conveners have not moved faster. But I think we're all aware that it is a very difficult diplomatic dance, if I can call it that. And I think we've done all we could to actually nudge this progress further and push the states parties to engage with us, and that is continuing very strongly. It is my hope that the League of Arab States countries will accept. Israel, in fact, has accepted to attend, so that they will accept to have another meeting late this year. But I also don't want to say that this is seen as an effort only to benefit the NPT. I don't think so at all. And I think we must be very clear that what we're trying to do here is to make a region more stable, irrespective of whether the NPT is going to take place, the review conference is going to take place in April next year or not. And I think somehow this is portrayed as a way of we're making more efforts because of the NPT. No, we're not. We're making efforts because this is a commitment that was given. This is a commitment that we want to fulfill, and that we need to have the cooperation of the parties to do so. The impact of the humanitarian process, humanitarian conference on the NPT, again, a very interesting question. I think that what we're seeing, and I'm glad that Tariq has already spoken about this, so I don't need to spend too much time on it, you can't really do this without the P5. I made that comment at the Nayarit conference in February, and I was vilified by the NGOs who basically felt I was wrecking the process. I don't think I'm wrecking the process. I'm just stating something that I think is obvious to everyone, except that no one really wanted to hear it at the time. But I think that the participation of the US and the UK next Monday and Tuesday is a very positive sign. Of course, it's a very cautious engagement on their side with no commitments other than we're here to listen. But the other aspect that I think is very important of this is that when it comes to the NPT conference and the non-nuclear weapon states, there has been this let's say distrust, maybe I could call it, of the P5 solidarity. There are meetings, I think you already spoke about the meeting that is going to take place in London in February, where again they will say this is our position. They are reporting jointly according to a joint format or a common format to the NPT review conference. So basically this is something that is seen to be as very cohesive, very solid, and all of a sudden with the humanitarian consequences, that solidarity is not there. I do think that when it comes to what is going to happen is that what is the expectation of the NPT review conference? And I think we have to be very clear that the impatience on the part of the non-nuclear weapon states has grown. I have seen this in all of the conferences, not only conferences like this here, where not everyone is present, but I've seen it particularly in the conferences that I held under the auspices of the United Nations, where there is increasing unhappiness, vocalization of this unhappiness, and a demand that something is going to happen. And what is really crucial is, I think, the perception difference between the non-nuclear weapon states who feel that Article 6, as short as it is a commitment to disarm, whereas the P5 are sort of saying, well, I think that we've done a lot of what is already expected of us, so therefore there is really no commitment. It's an indefinite extension not only of the NPT, but the freezing in power, let's say, if we have nuclear weapons, we are continuing to keep them. That, I think, is the biggest challenge that we really have in front of us, and that is something that we need to keep in mind. Now, what would be, and I like really Tariq's expectation in terms of the humanitarian consequence of what would actually be done, because I've argued for the same thing in terms of the P5 and the NPT. Give us goals, give us timelines, give us achievables that are actually coming down. I know that the action plan is going to be a very difficult subject. Yes, it was aspirational maybe, but one would expect to have a bit more than simply a glossary, which is one of the items that was requested under the plan. But we've also heard yesterday in some of the meetings how expensive it is to dismantle nuclear weapons. It is a huge cost factor. And so I think that there has to be some understanding, but that does not mean that it's impossible to do so, because modernization also costs something. So I would like to see something that is a lot more concrete. When it comes to our colleague from Belgium who asked about the laissez-faire approach, I really do think that there's this expectation on the part of the P5 that this will all blow over and it's business as usual. I don't share that. I really don't, because I've seen too much unhappiness in, as I said, the United Nations Forum, and I think we have to take account into that. Will it wreck the NPT conference? I don't think so, but I think it's there and it has to be recognized, and frankly, I think something needs to be done about it. Thank you.
Thanks. There are an awful lot of points that I would like to respond to. I'll try to be brief and be selective in what I have to say here. I think indeed one needs to be careful not to exaggerate the significance of the attendance by at least 2 nuclear weapon states at the meeting in Vienna next week. I'm still hopeful, and I think, as I mentioned yesterday, I'm not sure publicly or privately, that I would be surprised if China does not also join the United States and Britain, because I don't think they would like to be associated with the 2 other nuclear weapon states as the only outliers at the forthcoming review conference, but we can wait and see. But I think what's particularly important about the U.S. decision to join was, one, this was not an easy decision for them. There were very significant interagency battles over a long period of time, and the fact that the U.S. was prepared, and I give Rose in particular credit, to go to Vienna, I think is important because it will assist in developing a far more nuanced appreciation of the different perspectives held by the movers and shakers within the Humanitarian Impact Initiative. There's a bigger problem here, and I'm been particularly disturbed by a sense of a reverse mirror image held by members of the non-aligned movement and members of the nuclear weapon states, and particularly the Western nuclear weapon states. They have this black kind of box image of the other side. They tend to respond primarily to the more extreme elements on the U.S. side, more extreme elements in NAM. On the NAM side, the more extreme elements in the nuclear weapon states, and not to appreciate how differentiated the views are, and where there may be, in fact, considerable overlap in terms of objectives and approaches. And I think that by being at the meeting, by being at the table, it will help to enrich an appreciation of these areas where there may be more commonality than one would expect. And this is where I think 2000, and again I like to kind of point to these historical precedents. In 2000 you had the new agenda very active with an important agenda. And rather than rejecting it out of hand, basically the United States said, you know, we can accept 95% of that agenda. Let's not immediately object to the 5%. Let's more or less move forward, keep quiet, see what we can produce. And I think it was that orientation which made it possible for a negotiation to take place where, much to the surprise, I think, of many delegates and observers, you were able to accomplish a very significant set of agreements in the disarmament area in the form of the 13 practical steps. Now, whether that, the fact that many of them were never realized, never implemented is another story, but it shows how this flexibility can make a big difference. I think, to respond more specifically to Alan Ware's question, it's hard to know how this will play out, Alan, but I think it does, that is the participation by some of the nuclear weapon states in the meeting in Vienna, I think will help to reinforce the norm of non-use. I think it may make it more likely that there will be a focus among at least some of the nuclear weapon states on the need to reduce the reliance on nuclear weapons in national security policies. Key components not only of 2010, but 2000 as well. And I think we need as many advocates for that position as possible. So I think it will be reinforcing in that regard. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, Tom who asked the question about the impact of a failed review conference. And I think as Dr. Zerbo pointed out, it really depends very much on, what is the basis for the failure. I mean, a successful conference doesn't necessarily accomplish a great deal. And by the same token, a failed conference may not be that much of a failure if, in fact, it enables the development of initiatives outside of the context of the NPT, which can be contribute to the strengthening of the regime. So it depends very much on what brings down the conference. I had mentioned in my presentation some of the things that might lead to a collapsed review conference. I think it would be very unfortunate if at the beginning the atmosphere is not poisoned. I mean, we have to avoid, I think, the poisoning of the debate early on. And this is where Ukraine has the potential to be exceptionally disruptive, because in the general debate, if there are very imprudent statements made, which become personalized, I think that even more than the Middle East has the potential to make it very difficult to reach agreement on basically anything, and that can contaminate things well beyond the review conference. I'm sorry, I see the chair wants to cut me off here, so I will anticipate that and cease my remarks at this moment.
I have no power to cut you off. But I would like to give a chance to the second round. The lady next to Ambassador Kelly was, you were asking, then you, and then two questions. Four of you, please.
Thank you. Jenny Nielsen, University of Queensland. In line with the chair's initial comments, it has been argued that there are two narratives and communities exist, the deterrent strategic community and the NPT disarmament community. And I found myself explaining the P5 process to people in the strategic community. So my question to you, the panel, is to what extent do the discussions and deliberations on Article 6 and disarmament within the NPT review cycle actually filter through or resonate in the strategic community that shapes the decisions on nuclear doctrines and defense postures? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. Please.
My question was actually already answered, so thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Vladimir Kozin. I'm from Moscow-based Russian Institute for Strategic Studies. And I'm very happy, Dr. Schneider, that you mentioned Crimea in relation to nuclear capabilities. So it will be a nuclear-free zone, likewise the Kaliningrad region, Russian exclave. Kaliningrad region because of INF Treaty, because it covered Kaliningrad region or oblast. Crimea simply because we do not deploy SSBNs in the Black Sea, it's a closed water space. We do not deploy strategic heavy bombers, exceptional case when Tu-22 M just took part at the military exercises there, but it will be, as I said, denuclearized completely. There is no need to deploy nuclear forces there, be it strategic or tactical. As to the Middle East WMD free zone, yes, it's very good that Madame Kane, you reminded us of 1974 when the first idea has been articulated. But 40 years of doing nothing, I'm sorry to say that, it's a reprimand to all of us. So to break these difficulties, the Russian Institute for Strategic Studies prepared, so to say, academic draft relevant treaty and circulated it at the latest Moscow conference on the issues related to the NPT. By the way, all interested delegations have taken this draft, including Egypt, Israel, Finland for obvious reasons, you know, as well as Iran. They gave originally positive remarks, but later on decided to answer in details at the later stages. But nevertheless, I think it would be not bad to tackle the draft treaty related to this free zone. The violation of the Budapest Memorandum of December '94 has been mentioned in many venues. True, it has been violated, and it is violated, but not by the Russian Federation. It has been violated by Ukraine. By Ukraine because it violated paragraph 2 on not using military power against territorial integrity. I mean, they used military power against Donbass with 7.5 million people. By the way, all of them are Ukrainian citizens and using heavy weapons, cluster bombs and white phosphorus, etc. It also... Just a moment, sir. I listened to your remarks very carefully. And Article 3, not to use economic coercion against Ukraine. Russian Federation never used economic coercion. The recent example of the gas deal, bonuses, restructuring of debt of Ukraine for already supplied gas. There is a point related exactly to the violation of the Budapest Memorandum, because we have seen a lot of voices coming from Kiev that Ukraine would like to reconstitute its nuclear status, to create a clear nuclear bomb or dirty nuclear bomb. That's a very alarming thing. It would be a gross violation of the Budapest Memorandum, and that's why we plead to all Western community not to let Ukraine to acquire nuclear capabilities and its delivery systems for good, forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think it was a telling blend of deeds and words. Thank you for this. It was a very important contribution for all participants. Gentlemen behind you.
Nick Ritchie from the University of York in England. Part of the exasperation of non-nuclear weapon states is the pernicious and damaging myth that the NPT grants nuclear weapon states a right to possess nuclear weapons. Tony Blair in 2007 as Prime Minister said, the NPT makes it absolutely clear that Britain has the right to possess nuclear weapons, and that those who are the major nuclear powers can remain nuclear powers fully consistent with the NPT. It is recognised and it is at the heart of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I wonder what can be done to disabuse this myth, or that acknowledgement of having tested before the treaty was negotiated somehow translates into legal and legitimate right to possess. I wonder what can be done to disabuse that myth in 2015. Thank you.
Discussion becomes interesting, but we are running out of time. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I will have to give the floor to all speakers. I suggest in the reverse order. Dr. Zerbo, if you would like to start, and then we'll go in the reverse order.
I wanted to take on the last question from the gentleman from UK. This is the question that I face often when I'm invited in countries or regions where there is no nuclear weapon. Because that's basically what they say, why the NPT basically give the right to some and then stop others from having. And then they say the same for the CTBT, by the way. How can we get out of this? What I try to do, I try to talk to journalists in the developing world who ask this question by referring to a time when I was giving a talk at a school where young scholars were asking me, oh, we know that 5 are allowed, why others aren't? So what I'm telling them, I say, okay, let's take this room. And we are chairing, and then we realize that somebody say, okay, there are 4 guns that we just saw. There are 4 people who have guns. And we don't know how the guns came in. So the first thing we do is to close the door and make sure there's no more guns coming in. That's the first step we do, because you don't know where the guns are coming from. It's a fact. You've noticed that there are guns in the room. And then you want to deal with those and make sure that no one else tells you that there is a 5th or a 6th or a 7 and 20 or 50, and then it's out of control. So this is basically how I talk about the fact, that is that 5 have nuclear weapon. And then we start from that, and then we try to move on to stopping more people from having, because it makes us less in danger, because I won't say safer. It makes us less in danger if only 5 has, or even 10, 20, or 40 have. And then we start dealing with how we can get those 4 guns that are in the room, or 4 people who have the guns, to disarm, or to find a way to talk to them so that they don't use it. So that's basically what I've explained to scholars at the school in South Africa, where I was talking, and subsequently in Tokyo. That was at university, when people were telling me, oh, why do you want to stop Japan from developing nuclear weapon if our neighbors are testing and seeking a weapon to potentially destroy us? So it's the same question. So, but what I'm saying as well, we have to avoid, in this context of NPT and CTBT, to talk too much about those who want to preserve their weapon. You can talk in your national and domestic context, but when you talk outside that framework, I think it hurts others when you say that I have the right to possess and you guys don't have the right to develop, because then it becomes an emotional thing. And that's where the problem lies. The issue of non-proliferation, the issue of CTBT, the issue of disarmament in general has become emotional rather than anything linked to the reality or the practical fact. This is how I say it. So because of this emotion, people in different contexts should be able to talk differently, like diplomats. And unfortunately, I'm not a diplomat, I'm learning to be, but I'm just saying diplomats know well how to talk where they are, and to not go in an environment where they say, no, we want to make sure we have safe, reliable, and then we want to make sure you have none. So that's basically what I wanted to share in this context. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. I wanted to comment a little bit on your very first question about the benefits of nuclear abstinence, and the question that you raised about Ukraine having given up nuclear weapons along with Kazakhstan and Belarus. These were stationed nuclear weapons at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. There have been a number of op-eds written that had Ukraine retained these weapons, it might not have found itself to be in the predicament that it's in today. Others have argued, and I support their argument, that had Ukraine retained nuclear weapons, the crisis would have been even much worse. It would have provoked a nuclear crisis. It might have brought in other nuclear weapon states. And the stability that exists in Europe, even though parts of it might be under some challenge or threat, would be in a much worse situation. But people have commented, including countries like South Africa, that the initial recognition that South Africa got for giving up its nuclear weapons capability has over time vanished, and South African perspectives in the NPT in pushing for nuclear disarmament are no longer given as much credit as they were. Other people point out that Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons and was attacked. PPRK has nuclear weapons. Nobody threatens ever to the DPRK that all options are on the table. But you do hear that when it comes to Iran, and Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. So this is an issue, and partly to blame for the nuclear weapon states themselves, because they do use their nuclear weapons for political purposes in conflicts when it suits them. And it's the fault of the rest of us, the non-nuclear weapon states, for not challenging them. So in the NPT, there really should be only two groups, the 5 against the 184, not all these various other groups. The Cold War is long over, so why do we have a Western group, a non-aligned group, and an Eastern group? There are other functional groupings that are much more useful, like the New Agenda, the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative, Humanitarian, and so on. A couple of other points. Jenny, you raised a very good point, and this is something that I've been commenting on for a very long time. So you have two solitudes. At the NPT conference, there are people from the foreign ministries. Hardly any delegation has a representative from their defense ministry. So the foreign ministry diplomats in good faith are saying all these nice things about getting rid of nuclear weapons and so on. And my country, Canada, as a member of NATO, I remember way back when Canada had a very activist foreign minister, Lloyd Axworthy, who in a foreign minister's position was questioning the utility of nuclear weapons deployed in Western Europe and so on. And in the very next week after the 2000 Review Conference, the Canadian Defense Minister was happily signing on to nuclear weapons being an essential component of NATO defense policy, and that as long as nuclear weapons would exist, NATO would have a nuclear component. So there really isn't this connection between the foreign and defense ministries, and it's no surprise. And so I think this is something we need to work on, that in NPT delegations there do need to be some representatives from defense ministries, so at least they can report back to their superiors what other parts of their government have been saying in these meetings. Tom, you also raised a very good question. Again, it's our collective fault. We accept this nomenclature of P5. I really find it very offensive. This is not directed at you, but a general comment, that in the NPT context we use the term P5. Neither does the UN Charter nor the NPT give the P5 any status with relation to their nuclear weapons. So this concept of a P5 statement, I disagree with Bill here a little bit, is a very pernicious concept. If there is to be a statement, we should really call it a nuclear weapon state statement, not a P5 statement. Because some of the P5 have argued, and even some Canadian diplomats and other diplomats have said that because of the P5 have special responsibilities in the Security Council under Chapter 7, they do need to have nuclear weapons in the interest of maintaining or preserving international peace and security. And I think we should challenge that as much as we can. And it has been said in many conferences that indefinite extension of the NPT does not mean indefinite possession of nuclear weapons. So this is again something that needs to be highlighted. And finally, on the humanitarian initiative, I doubt very much that the presence of the nuclear weapon states will have any effect on their thinking or their policies on de-alerting, on their nuclear doctrines, modernization, or so on. The way the agenda is crafted, and this is no criticism of the Austrians, does not provide a way whereby the nuclear weapon states can be engaged on these issues. They are basically being lectured to here on all the various environmental, health, and other consequences. The agenda is set. Hopefully there will be a fourth such conference. Some people believe that it might be in South Africa. And hopefully in the fourth such conference one can find ways where we talk about these issues that can bring about some change in operations and doctrines. Thank you.
Tawfiq has already covered a lot of the ground that I was going to cover as well, so that saves me the work of doing that. Let me just bring in one argument that he has alluded to in an earlier intervention, but not yet, and that's again one of the misalignments, is there are 4 additional nuclear weapon states. And again, India, Pakistan get credit for being there in the humanitarian consequences. But on the other hand, the misalignment is also that there are 2 nuclear weapon states, Israel and India, which are kind of quietly welcomed, I don't know, into the club or whatever, even though they're not spoken about as such, but they basically get away, whereas all of the scrutiny is like also on Pakistan, on North Korea, and on Iran, which after all is a member of the NPT treaty and therefore is subject to to inspections and what have you. But again, all of these inspections and the non-proliferation are being tightened time and time again, and there's more and more money being spent on verifying. Nothing is being spent on verifying how many nuclear weapons there actually are in the possessor states. Nothing. That is something that is a very murky area, and I think there also needs to be shed some light on it, and I think that that would be very good. Let me add another aspect that is also very conveniently forgotten. When the concept of the P5 was started way back, when, it wasn't due to possession of nuclear weapons, because some of the states didn't have nuclear weapons at the time. And I think that's something that is kind of, I guess it's kind of receded into a historic unconsciousness, if I can call it that. But it is also a very important concept. I am very much against this, what you call nuclear weapons abstinence, or let's say on the part of, like, does it actually damage you in terms of if you don't have nuclear weapons? And I know that you raised this issue. It would have been different if Ukraine had had nuclear weapons. I really think we must discourage this. I mean, to even contemplate the possibility of yet another state acquiring nuclear weapons, I find pretty frightening. We've heard all about the near accidents that could happen. I think that it isn't quite as safe as it is always said. So I really think that it may be due to luck, and luck was used in a different context here by Bill Potter. But on the other hand, I do think that we should really very strongly discourage this from happening. And we have also seen that there can be very severe accidents with nuclear power plants. So that's another aspect that also one could throw into the balance. So it isn't all that safe to sort of say nuclear weapons, yes, please go ahead and have them, because we can take care of it as a government. I do have my doubts about that. I'm not a scientist, but on the other hand, I just know that human failure can at times contribute to that very strongly. Let me stop here.
I also appreciate the extent to which a number of the points I was going to make have already been made by my colleagues. I think I want to address an aspect of the Ukrainian situation and then to put it in a somewhat broader context. Having written a lot about nuclear renunciation decisions by Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, and while certainly the Budapest Memorandum was important, there were other major factors that impacted on the decisions, particularly by Ukraine and Kazakhstan, to part with the weapons that they inherited when the Soviet Union collapsed. And one of the important factors was the persuasive argument made that if these countries wanted to enjoy the benefits of the peaceful use of nuclear energy, then they could only do so by being members in good standing with the international community, of which being a non-nuclear weapon state party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty was a key element. And that was a compelling argument for those countries, particularly Kazakhstan and Ukraine, which had significant nuclear ambitions and as well as nuclear activities. One of the problems is that the perceived benefits of being a non-nuclear weapon state has been severely damaged. And this is something that is not likely to be well received, not only by nuclear weapon states, but by many non-nuclear weapon states. There have been very clear decisions taken, going back also to 1995, and paragraph 12 of the Principles and Objectives made it very, very clear that there was a consensus that countries that did not have full-scope safeguards, comprehensive safeguards in place should not benefit from nuclear trade. And yet we have collectively engaged in a form of amnesia by ignoring that. We talked about nuclear weapons-free zones. There are 3 nuclear weapons-free zones which explicitly prohibit nuclear trade with countries that do not have full-scope safeguards in place, and in the Central Asian zone case, the additional protocol as well. Members of those zones ignore this, and they're not being reminded of their obligations by the nuclear weapon states, all of them. And many of the countries represented here that are not nuclear weapon states also ignore this. This was reinforced by the exemption given to India by the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So it is somewhat disingenuous to talk about the importance of being a non-nuclear weapon state party to the NPT. At the same time, you provide special benefits to a nuclear weapons possessor that is also not a party to the NPT. And here, the only thing, I never disagree with Angela, but the one thing that where I do disagree is to talk about other nuclear weapon states. It's a very slippery slope. These are other nuclear weapons possessors. But there is, in fact, an effort being led by one of the so-called white knights of one of these nuclear weapons-free zones to redefine what it means to be a nuclear weapon state under the terms of the NPT. And so I think we have to be very cautious in our language here. So that's all I would say at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. We started later, so I hope you accept my apologies for crossing into coffee break, but we still have 20 minutes of coffee breaks ahead of us, and it allows us to very warmly thank to all participants of this panel. Please join me in thanking them.
Let's do